I cycled into the CBD recently and was astonished how long it took to meander through the diversions around the Anzac Bridge. I started wondering if I could quantify how much longer it was taking me to get into the city since the diversion commenced back in March. The first place I went was to my video archive, so what you're watching in the background here is a split screen of a non-detour ride from before March with a detour ride after March. From the corner of Gordon Street, it used to take me a bit over 3 minutes to reach the memorial statue of the digger on the bridge. With the detour, it is taking about 8 minutes. Problem with the video data is this is a data set of just 2 rides. I like to have a lot more data points to work with. Thankfully, we have applications like Strava data to work with. I went back to these 2 rides in Strava and created 2 new segments. Both started at the corner of Gordon Street and finished at the statue of the digger. That gave me 2 new sets of data. The first was my personal data for this segment, showing the 500 plus times I've ridden home over the Anzac Bridge since signing up with Strava. The second was the fastest times for every other Strava rider who has ridden these 2 segments. The problem with this is that I can use my data to create a bell curve showing the spread of my ride through times from fastest to slowest. However, the data we get from all users only shows their fastest times, so I don't get a realistic spread of the slowest to the fastest for each individual rider. But you know what? It's better than no data at all. Ideally, I would love to be able to match up every segment time for every cyclist who has ridden both segments and then calculate the differences for each individual cyclist. We could then see what the average delay time looks like. Once we have an average delay time across all cyclists, we can go the whole hog and calculate the benefit-cost ratio of the removal of the Victoria Road overbridge. After all, when new infrastructure is proposed, such as a new bridge or a widened road or a tunnel, the project finances are analysed to determine whether it is viable or not from an economic perspective. But why on earth would we want to do this? My response is that I give you an answer to a question raised in a parliamentary committee meeting earlier this year. Here's the question about reducing access east-west across the city, but I found the answer more interesting. I quote, "The alternative routes do not reduce access east-west across the city. There is a minor increase in some active travel trip times, depending on the point of origin." Now, I really had to laugh when I read this, because back in the early 1990s, I was employed as a policy analyst or policy advisor at CityRail, as it was known then, and part of my job was to write answers like this for our chief executive and the minister, that is, answers to parliamentary questions, and briefing notes for use in parliament as well. Sometimes a team of us would slave over a single question for hours, trying to craft the perfect answer that was as slippery as an oiled pig on an ice rink covered in ball bearings. The response had to appear to answer the question without really answering the question. It had to ensure that it contained no commitments to anything, admitted no errors or faults, and hopefully shut down any further questions. The last thing you wanted to do was to leave an opening to a further question. A really good answer was one that made the questioner feel like they had received a satisfactory response, even if in reality they hadn't. So I decided to focus on the part of the answer that says there is a minor increase in some active travel trip times. For starters, how do you define minor? Second, what work has been done to measure and quantify the increase in active travel trip times? I think that should be a follow-up question. How did they baseline active travel trip times before putting in the detour? And then how have they measured the trip times afterwards? What is the average increase? What does the distribution of delays look like? What has happened to active travel trip time reliability? Let's start with the most basic graph, one showing my ride times through this segment prior to the detour being put in place. For each data set, I calculated the average, the mean, and the standard deviation. This graph very clearly shows that my ride times are bunched around a spread of 3 minutes to about 3.5 minutes, also which with a mean of 3 minutes and 20 seconds. The standard deviation for me is 18 seconds, meaning that my ride times through this segment were pretty consistent before the detour went in. The next graph shows the fastest times for all 8,000 cyclists who have recorded a ride through this segment. Now that's not 8,000 rides, that's 8,000 individual cyclists, and it's the fastest time for each of them. You can see that the mean for all cyclists is slightly faster at exactly 3 minutes, with a wider standard deviation of 49 seconds as opposed to 18 for me. With such a wide spread of cyclists, that's expected. Strava members range from Olympic champions at one end of the spectrum to old plotters like me at the other end. We can then compare both data sets in two ways. The first just uses the raw numbers, and you can see that my hump is to the right of all the other riders' hump. But because there is an uneven number of data points, it's a bit uneven. Therefore, I calculated the percentage of rides in each 10-second bracket, and it looks like this. My individual distribution of times is much tighter than that for all cyclists, and I have a much better looking bell curve. But what about the data after the detour was put in place? Well, it looks a lot more lumpy. Adding a trend line makes it look a bit less lumpy, but it's definitely not a nice, smooth bell curve at this point. Let's get to the meat of the matter. How much longer does it take to ride this segment now as compared to before March? We can immediately see that the mean has moved out from 3 minutes to 5, and the standard deviation has more than doubled from 49 seconds to 108 seconds. That means that the average delay in each direction is around 2 minutes per person, and that the reliability of trip times has gone out the window. That's because this segment has gone from having no traffic lights to going through several sets of traffic lights, and the detour is often messed up by road works that close parts of the shared path, forcing detours within the detour. Clearly, there has been a negative impact on trip time and reliability. But is this impact minor? Well, 2 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, but just remember that traffic engineers spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year building stuff in order to save seconds, not minutes, seconds. Just try asking a signal engineer to change a cyclist traffic light from being green for only 3 seconds to 5 seconds. They'll scream that an extra 2 seconds is the end of the world, and the entire Sydney metropolitan area will be gridlocked around the clock for the rest of time if just 2 seconds is added. The fun part is putting a value on these delays. Thankfully, Transport for New South Wales makes the Transport Economic Appraisal Guidelines available freely online. You too can spend several hours figuring out what all these equations mean. Now, I'm familiar with this work from long ago. When I was at the railways, we engaged Professor David Henshaw a few times to do research for us, and I was the lucky one that got to wade through his reports and simplify them to the point where management could understand them. What this stuff is saying is that for non-business use, private use, delays cost the average person around $22 an hour. For business use, delays cost $53 an hour. Now, I am betting that this sort of analysis has never been applied to cyclists in New South Wales before, maybe even anywhere in Australia. It's only been applied to motorists. But if I'm commuting to work, a delay costs me the same regardless of the mode of transport I'm using. So let's assume that 1,000 cyclists ride back and forth through here every day, and the average delay in both directions is 2 minutes, so 4 minutes per person per day. Let's assume none of them are couriers, so we'll just use the delay cost of $22 for everyone. We multiply the numbers, and the delay costs work out at $1,467 per day. Given that the detour is in place 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, over the course of the year, the delays caused by this detour will cost the cycling community $535,000. And that's based on 2 minutes each way per person and 1,000 cyclists. I get the feeling that this number never made it into the business case. Now, let's go back to the answer of the parliamentary committee question, which was, the alternative routes do not reduce access east-west across the city. End quote. What can the data from Strava tell us about this response? I filtered the no detour segment to just this year and found that up until when the overbridge was demolished, 1,042 cyclists travelled this route. But in the 3 months since demolition, only 651 cyclists have gone this way, a 38% reduction. Now, you could argue that this is due to the lockdowns and fewer people travelling to work in the CBD. That may be true, but on the other hand, we've seen the number of cyclists grow by 100% to 200% during the lockdown. My personal experience of routes like the Bay Run and the Cooks River is that they are packed with swarms of cyclists that weren't there 3 months ago. Why aren't these people cycling across the Anzac Bridge? Well, one possibility is that they are riding across, but they haven't signed up for a fitness tracking app like Strava or Garmin or Map on Ride. Another explanation is they find the detours to be too dangerous and time consuming, so they're riding somewhere else, which would in fact mean that the alternative routes have reduced access east-west across the city, which means that answer to the parliamentary committee is completely wrong. We might also be seeing some commuter cyclists changing modes due to the hassle, which would need to be factored in as negative externalities. So my question to the person who drafted that response to the parliamentary committee is, what data did you use to make that statement? But let's wrap up here. What can we take away from all of this? Firstly, thanks to data from apps like Strava, and possibly Map My Ride and Garmin, it's now possible to measure things that had never been measured before. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if the data available to look deeply into cycling travel patterns is much better than that available to Transport for New South Wales for analysing driving patterns. I bet no one in Transport for New South Wales is aware of this. It might be the basis for an interesting Austroads project or some academic research in the transport field. 2. We have to be aware that Strava users are not representative of all cyclists. They tend to come from the sportier end of the population rather than the recreational end. That bias needs to be factored into any analysis you do. 3. I'd love to know how to download all this data from Strava rather than tediously screen scraping it, which took me a couple of hours. This sort of thing would also make a great Strava Labs project. 4. Now that these segments are set up, we can go back at any time and pull down the updated data and refresh the analysis with more data points. And I might do that in a month or two. I wonder if we'll ever end up with enough data a few months from now to see a smooth bell curve. 5. Some of the trips through these segments might be runners. I can't see a way to filter out just onto the cyclists. And that would account for the really long tail we see to the right. 6. And last, I haven't included the biggest potential costs in the benefit cost analysis, which are injuries or deaths resulting from crashes within the detour. The cost of a minor injury crash averages $142,000 and the cost of a death averages $6.7 million. Now, given the major increase in hazards produced by the detour, I wonder if a proper benefit cost analysis of removing the pedestrian overbridge would have recommended the creation of a much safer way of routing vulnerable road users around the worksite, even if it cost more to build it. I get the feeling a cheap and nasty detour has been bodged up because a detailed benefit cost analysis was never carried out. Now, if you've got any thoughts about how we can make better use of this data, let me know in the comments.